Some deaths asked to be mourned. Others refused to stay silent. The announcement was brief, clinical, devoid of detail. Yu Menglong had died. The cause was described as an accident. No further explanation followed. At first there was shock, then grief. Then something else began to surface, quietly and unevenly beneath the expected rituals of mourning. A hesitation, a pause where words should have been, an unease that lingered long after condolences were posted, edited, or quietly withdrawn. Yu Menglong was not known for controversy. He did not cultivate chaos around his name. Those who worked with him described a man who kept his head down, who listened more than he spoke, who carried himself with an almost unsettling gentleness in an industry rarely defined by restraint. His public image was clean, but more importantly, so were the private memories shared by those who knew him. There were no whispers of excess, no scandals buried in footnotes, nothing that prepared anyone for the abruptness of his end. That was what made the silence so disturbing. In the hours following the news, messages of grief appeared, then vanished. Tributes surfaced briefly before disappearing without explanation. Some were removed within minutes. Others were never posted at all, abandoned before they could take shape. No instructions were issued. No warnings were delivered. Yet the pattern was unmistakable. People stopped themselves. We have seen this behavior before, not as a directive, but as instinct. When individuals sense that something is wrong, yet cannot articulate why, they retreat into caution. They lower their voices. They choose safer words. They wait. And waiting, in cases like this, becomes its own kind of statement. The official explanation asked for acceptance, but acceptance did not come easily. Too many details felt unresolved. Too many reactions felt rehearsed or restrained. This was not outrage. It was something colder. A collective holding of breath. As if the truth, whatever it was, might be fragile. As if speaking too plainly might cause it to fracture beyond recovery. What unsettled people most was not what they were told, but what they were not. There were no thorough clarifications, no careful reconstruction of events, just a conclusion, offered with a finality that felt premature. The kind of finality that demands compliance rather than understanding. In the days that followed, those closest to Yu Menglong chose their actions carefully. Some honored him in indirect ways. Some avoided his name entirely. Others expressed grief through symbols rather than statements, through gestures that could be seen but not easily challenged. It was mourning conducted in fragments. This was not how accidents were usually received. Accidents invited questions, then closure. This death invited restraint. And restraint, when shared by so many at once, suggests awareness. If this was truly an accident, it would not need so much silence. In the days after Yu Menglong died, grief did not move like a wave. It moved like fog, low to the ground, quiet, persistent. It slipped into conversations and then retreated. It settled in the pauses between words, in the glances people exchanged before they decided what they could safely say. Weon was among the first to break that hush. He was not Yu Menglong's colleague in the ordinary sense. They were not the kind of men who shared a set every day. Their connection was older than any single project. It was personal. The kind of friendship built through long stretches of time, through years when success had not yet arrived and the world still felt negotiable. On the night he heard the news, Weon wrote a tribute. It was not a statement crafted for attention. It read like a message delivered to a doorway that no longer opened. He spoke of stars going home to sleep, He spoke of peace beyond suffering. He attached a photograph of himself beside Yu Menglong, a simple image that carried the weight of proof. This was real. This was a life. This was a man who existed beyond rumors. 10 minutes later, the post vanished. No explanation followed. No warning appeared. The disappearance itself became the message. It was as if the act of mourning had crossed an invisible boundary. Later, Wyon offered a restrained clarification. He said he was not an official source. He said he was waiting, hoping the news was false. He did not sound like a man retracting a lie. He sounded like a man stepping back from a ledge he had not realized was there. That moment lingered, because it explained something people rarely admit out loud. A person can be pressured without being threatened. Fear does not always arrive in the form of a phone call. Sometimes it arrives as a memory of what happens to those who speak too plainly. Still, Wyon did not disappear. He surfaced again, and this time he did not whisper. During a live stream, his tone shifted from grief to resolve. He spoke as an ordinary person, not a celebrity. He said his stream had been blocked. He said he might have stepped on toes, threatened someone's interests. Then he said something that sounded less like confidence and more like a vow made in desperation. He said he would fight until the end. He said he could quit. He could leave the industry. He could start over. But he would not bow to what he called evil forces. The reaction was immediate. It was not unanimous. Some praised him for speaking. Some pleaded with him to stop. There is a specific kind of public anxiety that forms when people believe a danger is real, but cannot name it. In those moments, support becomes tangled with fear. Messages of encouragement arrive beside warnings. Admiration is paired with urgency. Protect yourself. The water is too murky. They do not blink. They are ruthless. Do not become the next one. These were not words spoken by people who felt secure. These were words spoken by people who believed they had seen enough to know the cost of courage. We should pause here, because in many stories, this is where the myth begins. The hero rises. The enemy is defined. The lines sharpen. But the reality surrounding Yu Menglong did not sharpen. It blurred, and the blur was the point. The more people tried to speak openly, the more the language changed. Names became hints. Statements became poems. Tributes became symbols. It was as if grief had to disguise itself to survive. Actor Li Lin did not stage a protest. He did not make a speech. He chose something older than speech. He organized a Buddhist ritual on Yu Menglong's behalf. The footage of that ceremony carried a quiet intensity that felt almost unbearable. Li Lin stood before the altar, struggling to speak. His eyes were red. His voice caught. Again and again he avoided saying the full name. He referred instead to "my dear friend," as if even a name could invite consequences. Yet when the moment arrived to write the plaque, the avoidance broke. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, and he wrote the two characters that mattered. Menglong. A name written in ink is still a name spoken to the world. And it was one of the most direct acts of defiance anyone offered, because it did not demand agreement. It simply insisted on remembrance. At the same time, others found their own ways to mourn without declaring anything at all. Singer Hua Chen-yu performed a song at a music festival. The performance itself was not explicitly connected to Yu Menglong. The connection came from what people saw. The stage backdrop featured a white human-shaped silhouette falling from a height. A towering structure and staircases rose behind it, Glass seemed to shatter continuously across the screen. And above it all, a colossal black hand hovered, positioned like a force that could not be argued with. Then, at the climax of the song, another hand appeared. Soft, white, reaching out to cradle the falling figure. It was not evidence. It was not testimony. It was a metaphor rendered in light and shadow. Yet thousands understood it instantly, because metaphor is often the only language left when direct speech feels impossible. People cried, not because they believed they had witnessed a confession, but because they recognized the ache inside the image, the wish that someone, anyone, could have reached out in time. This was how the living began to speak. Not with accusations, not with declarations, with symbols, with rituals, with art, with silence shaped into meaning. And through it all, the pattern repeated. Posts vanished. Messages were erased. Fan groups were shut down. People who persisted became targets of rumor, caution, and collective worry. Mainland actress Sun Lin stepped forward repeatedly. She claimed she had acquired key clues. Shortly afterward, she was injured by a flower pot that fell from above as she stepped out to collect a package. Some called it coincidence. Others did not. Sun Lin posted a photograph of herself receiving an IV drip. Beneath it, she wrote 3 words: she refused to accept. She later posted an acrostic poem. Read downward, the first characters spelled a demand. Yu Menglong suffered injustice. Reopen the investigation. The post disappeared within seconds. She posted again. What are they so afraid of? Then she posted again, revealing that her statements were being removed and the groups supporting the cause were being shut down. Next time, just delete me too. These were not the words of someone seeking attention. They were the words of someone watching her own voice being erased, while the story she mourned refused to die. If the case had been simple, it would have faded. It would have resolved into quiet acceptance. Instead, each deletion only deepened the sense that the truth was being handled like contraband. We have to be careful not to confuse suspicion with proof. Proof belongs to records, testimony, forensic clarity. Suspicion belongs to patterns and instincts. But patterns, when repeated, become hard to ignore. And in this case, the pattern was not violence. It was restraint. It was a world in which people mourned carefully, as if grief itself carried risk. They were not told to stop. They simply knew when to be quiet. When words became dangerous, people turned to another language. Not because it was safer, but because it was harder to prosecute. Harder to pin down. Harder to erase completely. That language was symbol. It also looked from the outside like the supernatural. In the weeks after Yu Menglong's death, the public sphere began to fill with unusual figures. Self-proclaimed mediums, paranormal investigators, psychics who claimed to see beyond what a camera could capture. Some viewers dismissed them immediately. Others listened, not because they believed every claim, but because belief was not the point. The point was that the living were searching for a place to put their questions. When official narratives feel incomplete, the human mind does what it has always done. It expands outward. It invents frameworks. It turns coincidence into omen. It turns silence into a sign. Several paranormal figures from outside Yu Menglong's world became involved. One described surveillance of his live stream. Another spoke of people being tracked through comment sections. These claims were not verifiable through the transcript alone, and they should not be treated as confirmed fact. But their presence mattered because they reflected the atmosphere surrounding the case. a belief that even watching was not entirely safe. One of them described Yu Menglong as a son of light, a pure spirit being pursued and trapped. It was language that belonged to myth. Yet myth often surfaces when reality feels too bleak to interpret plainly. Another, an American psychic named Candace, claimed she first noticed the name as if it were an ordinary word. She later described repeated visions during live streams. A crying dog, distressing scenes, a sense of unfair treatment so intense it moved her to tears. Again, we cannot treat visions as evidence, but we can treat them as artifacts of human response. People were not merely asking who. They were asking why. Why would someone like Yu Menglong die like this? Why did the story feel unfinished? Why did every attempt to speak openly collapse into deletion? Rumors multiplied. They always do. Some were grotesque. Some were oddly specific. One rumor claimed Yu Menglong had suffered humiliations on set while alive. Another claimed his hair had been forcibly pulled out. At first, many dismissed it. How could something like that happen in public, surrounded by crews and cameras? Then a photograph surfaced. It showed a bald patch on the back of his head. A photograph, unlike a vision, carries weight. It can still be misunderstood, misrepresented, taken out of context. But it changes the emotional temperature. It makes people pause, because it suggests the possibility that something had been happening quietly, long before the final day. And if quiet cruelty had been present during life, then the silence after death felt less like coincidence and more like continuation. This is where the story begins to resemble a haunting, even without ghosts. A haunting is not defined by supernatural proof. It is defined by persistence, by a sense that the past has not released its grip on the present. By the way, ordinary spaces begin to feel contaminated with questions. In this case, the haunting was social, psychological, spiritual only in the sense that people were searching for meaning in the absence of trustworthy closure. Symbols began to appear everywhere. A silhouette falling, a black hand overhead, a white hand trying to catch. Rituals performed in temples. Poems designed to hide messages in plain sight. Names avoided, as if names could summon consequence. It is tempting to see these gestures as melodrama. But they are not theater. They are survival strategies. A person who believes speech is being monitored will not speak directly. They will gesture. They will encode. They will mourn through metaphor. And that is precisely what happened. The most striking aspect of the Buddhist ceremony was not the incense or the chanting. It was the way Li Lin's throat tightened when he tried to speak. It was the way he called Yu Menglong "my dear friend" until he could no longer avoid the name. A name is the first human claim we make over a life. To say it is to insist the person existed, not as a headline, not as a rumor, as a human being. That insistence became the core of the public response. People dug into Yu Menglong's past, not to expose scandal, but to understand how someone so ordinary in his kindness could end in such extraordinary controversy. They found videos, a birthday, a train station crowd, Yu Menglong looking shy and chubby, not like a star but like a neighbor. He answered questions seriously. He did not sneer. He did not keep distance. He treated fans like people rather than noise. They found another clip of him signing an autograph for a 6-year-old child, patting the child afterward, thanking him. These details do not prove anything about the circumstances of death. But they prove something else. He was not an easy person to hate. He was not an obvious candidate for public controversy. When someone like that dies and the story closes too quickly, the mind refuses to accept it. It feels like a violation of the moral order, even for viewers who do not know him personally. This moral disturbance is what often gives rise to supernatural language. Not because demons are involved, but because injustice feels like a force. It feels like something larger than individual choice, something that manipulates outcomes from the shadows. The case began to speak through codes because ordinary speech felt insufficient. If you cannot ask your questions openly, you ask them indirectly. If you cannot name what you fear, you describe it as a hand hovering over a life. And that is why the symbols mattered. Not as proof, as confession of atmosphere. When names cannot be spoken, symbols begin to speak for them. There is a common mistake made by those who believe they are untouchable. They assume the public is forgetful. They assume outrage is shallow. They assume grief can be outlasted. Sometimes they are right. But arrogance has a weakness. It speaks too loudly. It laughs at the wrong moment. It reveals the shape of what it is trying to hide. In this case, the turning point did not arrive through forensic discovery. It arrived through language. A writer named Zhao Lihua became a focal point of public fury after she defended a figure being questioned by the public. Her tone was not conciliatory. It was dismissive. She suggested that ordinary people could not create meaningful disruption. In one exchange, she mocked the idea of a boycott, implying that even large numbers of critics would be incapable of producing consequences. It was not her opinion that ignited the backlash. It was her certainty. Certainty, when delivered with contempt, invites scrutiny. People began to look into her background. They questioned her work. They questioned her authority. They questioned how she could speak with such assurance about what the public could or could not do. They discovered that she held a formal role in a company. They noted inconsistencies in reported capital figures and the appearance of a staff count that seemed implausible. They speculated about what this might imply. We should be careful here. Public speculation can be sharp, and it can also be reckless. But the fact of scrutiny itself was unavoidable. Then came the personal detail that transformed her from an ordinary commentator into an emblem of power. She was identified as the second wife of a high-ranking official. We will not pursue politics here. We do not need to. Power does not require ideology to operate. It requires proximity, protection, the quiet assurance that consequences apply to others. Once that detail entered the conversation, people understood her tone differently. Her contempt no longer sounded like arrogance alone. It sounded like experience. Like someone who had lived long enough within systems of protection to believe herself beyond public reach. This is where the case heated up, not because new evidence appeared, but because public perception shifted. The story was no longer about whether Yu Menglong died by accident. It was about whether the people surrounding the story behaved like individuals who expected questions, or like individuals who expected obedience. Zhao Lihua then wrote a statement that contained a phrase with explosive potential. She accused critics of harassing innocent people, of muddying the waters to cover up the real killer. The words landed like glass breaking in a quiet room. The real killer. If the death was truly an accident, the phrase did not fit. Accidents do not require real killers. Accidents have causes, conditions, failures. They do not have killers. The public seized on the phrase immediately. Was it an expression used casually without meaning? Was it rhetorical exaggeration? Was it a deliberate attempt to divert attention? Or was it a moment of carelessness that revealed what she believed privately? We cannot know her intent. Intent requires testimony, context, and evidence we do not have here. But we can recognize the effect. The phrase introduced a new line of suspicion that could not easily be erased. It also created a contradiction with another narrative circulating at the time, that the incident was a simple accident. If influential voices were insisting on accident, why would someone within the same orbit speak of a real killer? This conflict did not produce proof. It produced a fracture. And fractures are where stories bleed. From that moment, the case ceased to feel like a closed file. It became a living dispute, fueled not by official statements, but by the language of people who believed the public could be mocked into submission. There is a strange cruelty in that belief. It treats grief as temporary noise. It treats mourning as a trend that will pass. It treats the dead as a problem of public relations rather than a human loss. And that cruelty is what transformed Zhao Lihua into a symbol. Not because she was the center of the case, but because she embodied the attitude that made the case unbearable. The sense that some lives can be dismissed, and some questions are not meant to be asked. The public did not need to be told to pay attention. The phrase did the work on its own. It suggested a truth trying to break through a carefully controlled surface. Sometimes a case is reopened by a judge. Sometimes it is reopened by evidence. And sometimes it is reopened by a single careless sentence. Sometimes the truth does not confess. It slips. By the time the noise began to fade, one thing had become clear. The death of Yu Menglong was no longer confined to the circumstances of a single night. It had escaped the boundaries of time and explanation. It lingered, not because answers were absent, but because the absence itself felt deliberate. There are cases that end with resolution. Documents are signed. Causes are declared. The public moves on. This was not one of them. What remained was a collection of impressions rather than conclusions. A man remembered for his gentleness. Friends who chose symbols over statements. Words written and erased. Rituals performed without names. A single phrase that slipped out where it did not belong. None of these elements alone proved anything. Together, they formed something more unsettling than proof. They formed doubt that refused to dissolve. Yu Menglong's life, when examined closely, offered no easy explanation for the storm that followed his death. Those who searched his past did not find chaos. They found consistency, a quiet professionalism, a kindness that appeared genuine even when the cameras were off. He was not remembered as someone who provoked conflict. He was remembered as someone who endured. That endurance in hindsight became part of the tragedy. The people who continued to speak about him did not frame themselves as heroes. Most of them appeared reluctant, cautious, aware of the risks that accompanied visibility. Their actions suggested not ambition, but obligation. As if silence felt heavier than consequence. As if remembering him openly was the only remaining way to preserve their own sense of integrity. We should be careful not to romanticize this. Silence is not always oppression, and speaking is not always bravery. But there are moments when restraint itself becomes revealing. When too many people hesitate at once, the hesitation begins to look like knowledge. No supernatural force needs to be invoked to explain this. Fear is sufficient. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being isolated. Fear of becoming the next name. People avoid speaking aloud. And yet, even fear has limits. The story persisted because people continued to ask questions, not loudly, but persistently. They asked through images, through ceremonies, through careful phrasing, through the simple act of refusing to forget a name. In doing so, they transformed the case from a closed incident into a living inquiry. What haunts this story is not the possibility of hidden forces or unseen hands. What haunts it is the realization that truth does not always vanish when suppressed. Sometimes it changes shape. It becomes fragmented. It learns to survive in whispers and glances and symbols that cannot be easily erased. We are left then not with answers but with responsibility. Responsibility to remember that Yu Menglong was a person before he was a controversy. Responsibility to recognize that silence can be chosen, but it can also be inherited. Responsibility to understand that when power assumes it can outlast conscience, it often underestimates the patience of memory. This case may never offer the clarity that some seek. It may never provide a final narrative that satisfies every doubt. But its significance lies elsewhere. It lies in the discomfort it created. The way it disrupted certainty. The way it forced people to confront the cost of quiet acceptance. In the end, the question is not who is responsible. The question is what happens when no one is. Because when a death cannot find rest, it does not disappear. It waits. It lingers. It reminds us that forgetting is not a neutral act, and neither is silence.